Hi, Misha here, and before we start talking about the trooper variants, I thought let's kind of go back and look at the origins of the Stormtrooper Corps and others, and how they did definitely evolve from the clones, but were separate and apart. So with that, we have a few of the early Imperials, many of which carried over directly from the Clone Wars, including a lot of their ordnance, weapons, armor, and even the brains behind him. Since we covered him last time, I'm not going to say much about the good old clone Commando, one of my favorites. But there was one final batch of clones after the Clone Wars, and they were put into service, and typically the elites were kept around and used longer, including some of their Catan armor, backpacks, although they would continue to use some of their old guns. They would start using some of the new Imperial ones, including early versions of the E-10 and E-11. And the Commandos were not just important because they did bolster the very young Empire. They also were tapped for the next two roles. This is the so-called Elite Trooper, which turned into the TK Trooper with Project War Mantle. Essentially, Phase 2 clone armor, slightly redone, reworked. And these were not always or even often clones themselves. They were trained by clones, often clone commandos. You had Scorch and Crosshair, who trained the first generations of Elite or TK troopers. But typically under the visor were recruits, volunteers, and they were taught tactics for the new Empire. Tarkin and others felt that cloning was no longer necessary, too costly, too much infrastructure, maybe too vulnerable, and while clones were excellent soldiers, very highly trained and skilled, that's not what the young Empire needed. It needed more troops, but they were going to be doing more suppression of locals, rebels, mopping up separatist cells, but they needed as many as they could get from around the galaxy, and it also kept the young men and women of the galaxy employed in doing something. Induct someone into the TK Corps, instead of becoming a rebel, they would start to serve you. So yeah, they would kind of use the leftover clones, especially the more skilled and experienced ones, to train these guys. They start off with a sample batch of 1,000, and after they proved their worth, they would do more. This is the second generation clone body, and he really does stand well. I'll give him that. I gave him a DC 17. I don't know, kind of acknowledgement of the clone connection, that he could have used any of the guns, even the older DC 15s and whatnot. But again, kind of bolstering over. But this was stuff happening in the very, very early days of the Empire. Really between the era of about 19 and 14 BBY. But it was just a step on the road. After the proof of concept TK worked, the full-fledged Stormtrooper Corps would happen, and essentially, once the Stormtroopers came in, the clones were out. Moving on, another group of clones that were kept in service for a while were the so-called Shocktroopers, or Coruscant Guard. These were formed right at the end of the Clone Wars and were basically taken from the security forces led by Commander Fox on Coruscant, and they were provided with slightly higher end equipment, better training. They were trained more as crowd control police forces than anything else, but of course they were still clones and typically had phase 2 armor with a pauldron. This is kind of showing where the whole pauldron thing comes from, and for whatever reason they seem to prefer the longer DC-15A blaster, although they did have some of the DC-15S carbines. Part of it, I think, was just the look of the thing. I think it fit the aesthetic of a guard police force more. Some of the other clones kind of ridiculed the Coruscant Guard for having cleaner armor and not seeing a lot of direct action, but they were also among the most loyal to Palpatine himself, with the red markings. And again, of course, Fox is rather infamous for his positioning. But a lot of clones would actually stay on in this form as a shock trooper for a number of years, at least until they did start to age out. By 1514 BBY, the accelerated aging was taking a toll. In biological terms, they were approaching 20 years, which means in their accelerated term, they were 35, 36 years old at the very least. Not exactly at their prime, not exactly completely useless, but yeah, kind of getting there. But this was one area where clones hung on longer than just in the field. Again, this is that second generation body. Now been kind of supplanted, but still like it for what it is. Another figure from the Bad Batch. But the clone Shocktroopers would directly lead to our next and final figure. The Imperial Shock Stormtrooper, or Guard. These could actually still even be clones. Some other clones would go into the direct Royal Guard, although this was its immediate predecessor and contemporary. Essentially specialized training, red markings on the armor. And while they would guard installations and the Emperor and others on Coruscant, they would also be sent into the field. If the Emperor had to go somewhere, they were his protectors. They often had heavier equipment than standard stormtroopers. That's why I actually have him carrying a DLT-19 heavy blaster, long blaster. Another blast tech. This is less well known and more of a specialty gun. It had a lot more powerful bolts, and it had better range. In fact, it could take down light armor, even penetrating more. But the trade-off was, lower capacity and more energy consumption, and just more time to deploy, more space. They were really preferred by troops in open fields, open environments, scouts, recon. And again, these guys would do it for protecting the Emperor so they could take things down before a threat got too close. He does have a E11 on his belt, though, for close-in backup use. So it's the holster style. But yeah, these could be clones or recruits. Increasingly, of course, more and more recruits. And eventually, I think this style would mostly be phased out in favor of the Royal Guard. But either way, direct lineage to the clones and directly connected to the previous Shock Trooper. So a little bit shorter one this time. Just want to kind of go over the clone types that evolved into the early Stormtroopers. And you can see they were pretty much starting off as actual elites. Special guards, special protections, which really does explain why the Stormtrooper was classed as an elite group. Because in the beginning they were. But did they ever lose it? Well, regardless of that, they definitely became more and more specialized and put upon more and more. As I said in the previous video, there were even efforts to kind of push out the standard army trooper or soldier in favor of just more and more Stormtroopers, although that never happened in reality, and that's probably a good thing. So we'll see them expanding out. But these would not be the only clones that would stay in for a while longer either. There'd be another couple of specialized roles. We'll get to those soon. Right, Miss Peanut? Thinks she's kind of tired, aren't you? Yep. We'll catch you very soon. Next time.